Hello and welcome to our presentation on the French Revolution.
Obviously, this is about the French Revolution and all that horribly awesome stuff that occurred in that time period.
When you hear the word revolution, you probably think about our own revolution here in the good old US of A.
Unfortunately, the French Revolution was much more violent and dark than our own revolution, but that's just an exaggeration, right?
Unfortunately, it's fact. The events that occurred in this time period, no matter how little, shaped history forever.
France in the 19th century was a very prosperous country, although it had tremendous issues when it came to collecting taxes, thanks to their society structure.
Kings and nobles, now known as the Ancien Régime, did not pay taxes. If they didn't pay, then who did? The people.
The true moneymakers, aka the clergy, in France never spent a single franc on taxes, while everyone below them, aka the hard-working but not so moneymakers, had to support the country with their small wages.
As a result of this horrid system, they were so far down the hole they didn't know what to do. It didn't help that King Louis XVI was spending half of his national budget to service the federal debt.
Louis made several attempts to fix this problem with different financial ministers. The king even called for a local democracy to help aid the money issue.
Oh, and didn't we mention the series of storms that basically ruined many crops, causing widespread hunger? The citizens of France were not only poor, but they were hungry and angry too.
As his people whom depended on him starved and struggled to pay taxes and buy money, the king lived a lavish and definitely not starving life in his extravagant palace with his wife, Marie Antoinette.
Both convinced were that God gave them the right to rule. Contrary to their popular beliefs, thinkers like Immanuel Kant began to question the actuality of a God being able to mandate rulers, let alone exist.
To sum it all up, we have the hungry peasants, intellectuals debating the existence of a God, and those rich boys in the clergy doing whatever those rich Frenchmen do instead of working towards reform.
In response to the crisis, Louis XVI called the Estates General, the closest thing that France had to a national parliament, which hadn't met since 1614.
The Estates General was like a super parliament made up of representatives from the First Estate, the nobles, the Second Estate, the clergy, and the Third Estate, everyone else.
The Third Estate showed up with about 600 representatives. The First and Second Estates both had about maybe 300, and after several votes, everything was deadlocked, and then the Third Estate was like, you know what, you guys? Forget you. We're gonna leave, and we're gonna become our own National Assembly.
This did not please King Louis XVI, so when the new National Assembly left the room for a break, he locked the doors and he was like, sorry guys, you can't go in there, and if you can't assemble, how are you gonna be a National Assembly?
Shockingly, the Third Estate representatives were able to find a different room in France, this time an indoor tennis court where they swore the famous tennis court oath.
And they agreed not to give up until a French constitution was established.
So then, Louis XVI responded by sending troops to Paris, primarily to quell uprisings over food shortages. But the revolutionaries saw this as provocation, so they responded by seizing the Bastille prison on July 14th, which coincidentally is also Bastille Day.
The Bastille was stormed ostensibly to free prisoners, although there were only 7 in jail at the time, but mostly to get guns. But the really radical move in the National Assembly came on August 4th when they abolished most of the ancient regime. Feudal rights, tithes, privileges for nobles, unequal taxation, they were all abolished in the name of writing a new constitution.
And then on August 26th, the National Assembly proclaimed the Declarations of Rights of Man and Citizen, which laid out a system of rights that applied to every person and made those rights integral to the new constitution.
That's quite different from the American Bill of Rights, which was begrudgingly tacked on at the end and only applied to non-slaves. The Durham Act declared that everyone had the right to liberty, property, and security, rights that the French Revolution would do an exceptionally poor job of protecting. But as noted, this same can be argued for many other supposedly more successful revolutions.
Meanwhile, back at Versailles, Louis XVI was still King of France and was looking like France might be a constitutional monarchy.
Which might have meant that the royal family could hang on to their awesome house. But then, in October of 1789, a rumor started that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain somewhere inside the palace.
And in what became known as the Women's March, a bunch of armed peasant women stormed the palace and demanded that Louis and Marie Antoinette move from Versailles to Paris, which they did.
To many people at the time, the French Revolution was not primarily about fancy Enlightenment ideas. It was mostly about lack of food and a political system that made economic contractions hardest on the poor. The first phase of the revolution started with the National Assembly's yearning to create a constitutional monarchy. They believed that the king was necessary for a functioning state, and they were mainly concerned that the voters and the office holders be men of property.
Only the most radical wing, the Jacobins, called for a creation of the Republic. But things were about to get much more revolutionary, and also worse for France.
First, the Jacobins had a huge petition drive that got a bit unruly, which led troops controlled not by the king, but by the National Assembly to fire on the crowd, killing 50 people.
And that meant that the National Assembly, which had been the revolutionary voice of the people, had killed people in an attempt to reign in revolutionary favor.
You see this a lot throughout history during revolutions. What looked like an innocent uprising for change suddenly becomes a bloody mess.
Meanwhile, France's monarchical neighbors were getting a little bit nervous about all this revolutionary business and feared that the French example would then spread revolution to their own countries.
One of these concerned monarchs was Leopold II of Austria, who is in fact Marie Antoinette's brother. Also, like a lot of monarchs, Leopold II liked the idea of monarchies, and he wanted to keep his job as a person who ruled. So he and King William Frederick II of Prussia together issued the Declaration of Pillnitz, which promised to put the King of France in a state to strengthen and restore the French monarchy.
However, these European monarchs were too suspicious of each other to undertake such a task. At this point, Louis and the National Assembly had developed a plan to invade Austria. Many people in France wanted war, as reactionaries hoped that a preoccupation with war could cool off the revolution.
France's idea was to plunder Austria's wealth and maybe steal some Austrian food to shore up French food supplies, and also for the leftists to spread revolutionary zeal. But what actually happened is that Prussia joined Austria in fighting the French.
Defeats in war coupled with economic shortages reinvigorated popular groups that had been dormant in France and led new political demonstrations against the king. Radical Parisian political groups declaring themselves an insurrection army commune organized a mob attack on the royal palace.
And as a result, the assembly voted to suspend the monarchy, have new elections in which everyone could vote as long as they weren't women, and create a new republican constitution. Soon, this convention decided to have a trial for Louis XVI, who was found guilty of treason and was sentenced to die by the wrath of the guillotine.
This made it difficult for Austria and Prussia to restore him to the throne and ultimately led to the complete destruction of the old regime. The death of Louis XVI sparked the beginning of the Reign of Terror, the bloodiest phase of the revolution.
People started to believe that because they killed the king, they could kill anyone who stood in their way, which is what the government did under the leadership of the Committee of Public Safety, led by Maximilien Robespierre.
The terror saw the decapitation of 16,000 enemies in the revolution in the course of 9 months using the guillotine. Most of the victims ranging from royalists, such as Queen Marie Antoinette, to thousands of peasants, even Robespierre himself.
The bulk of the terrorist executions took place in the Vendée and in cities such as Lyons and Marseille, places that had been open rebellion against the authority of the National Convention.
While France was broke and fighting, the Committee of Public Safety wanted to introduce a new order. They pursued a policy of de-Christianization, which involved churches being pillaged and closed, the encouragement for priests to marry, and the word saint being removed from all street names.
Yet another manifestation of de-Christianization was the adoption of a new Republican calendar that renamed all the months and decided that every day would have 10 hours and each hour 100 minutes.
It even eliminated Sundays, saints' days, church holidays, and festivals.
Restructuring time itself made the French government believe that it offered the opportunity to forge new habits and create lasting new order. A little later, after the Reign of Terror, the revolution ceased for a while and another constitution was introduced, this one giving a lot more power to wealthy people.
At this point, France was still at war with Austria and Britain, wars that France ended up winning, largely thanks to the little corporal named Napoleon Bonaparte. The war introduced a multitude of coups, one of which taking place in 1799. It established Napoleon Bonaparte as the first consul of France.
Not only that, but it granted him almost unlimited executive power under yet another constitution. He had an overwhelming influence over the legislature, appointed members of the bureaucracy, controlled the army, and conducted foreign affairs.
Napoleon had once said, "I am the revolution," and he never ceased to remind the French that they owed him the preservation of all that was beneficial in the revolutionary program.
In 1802, Napoleon was made the Consul of Life, and in 1804, he crowned himself emperor. The event marked the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the Napoleonic era, in which French came to dominate much of continental Europe.
Slowly but surely, the nobles came back to France, although they had mostly lost their special privileges. The Catholic Church returned too, although much weaker because it had lost land and the ability to collect tithes.
When Napoleon fell due to a failed invasion of Russia and faced a bloody defeat against a combined Prussian and British army, France restored the monarchy and had a king once more, including a nobility and an established religion. At this time, it was definitely not a democracy or a republic. Thanks for watching!